There we go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'm just sharing my screen here. Okay, here we go. So we are taking you through optimizing real-world evidence with big social data. I'm Jackie Kivers, joined by Abhinav Banja, and we will be talking you through our experience and of doing these types of exercises, and hopefully enabling you to do so on your own as well. Broadly, we're going to be answering the following questions. What is an RWE study and how does it differ from traditional social listening and insights exercises? What do outputs from an RWE study look like? So what is the output? How is it used? How do you conduct these studies? What is the value of social real-world data throughout the clinical pipeline? And lastly, what are the best practices for harnessing social media data for real-world evidence? So we're going to seek to answer all of these questions. If you do have any further questions, as Ben said, we are leaving time at the end of our webinar to answer any questions that you may have. And if you're viewing this at a later point, certainly follow up with us. We're happy to answer any questions you may have. So broadly, the structure of our talk today is going to be kind of showcasing what big data is used for in RWE, and then how it's done. And then lastly, kind of what good looks like as well, and some best practices. So Abhinav and I will each be taking on some different sections, but may chime in here and there to help add any points. So first of all, what is an RWE study and how does it differ from traditional social listening? So real-world evidence is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of RWD, real-world data. So real-world evidence can provide information on different areas, such as the course of the disease, the efficacy, the outcomes of research, or even the safety and tolerability of products for different therapeutic areas. So traditionally, RWDD is patient-specific, and it's not collected during the clinical trial. It's all of the different points of data that are reflected by the patient's experience. So their records from hospital visits, their GP visits. This could be information that's collected through patient registries. It could come from insurance claims data. It could be primary or secondary research. It could be observational data, prescription data, or even data that's shared from connected devices such as an Apple Watch or a metabolic tracker. So it's all of the data that's relevant to the patient experience, and it helps provide a view of what patients are actually encountering in their day-to-day lives. So why is this important? Well, first of all, not only is it important, but the FDA and EMA are promoting inclusion of real-world data in the kind of medical device and therapeutic area treatment development. So they're looking to not just the scientific research, but to the data and research that's shared by patients to get more of a holistic view of the patient experience and treatment areas. Next, while it doesn't have the nuances of randomized clinical trials, it does have the benefit that it's not filtering out any of the data. So on the basis of inclusion or exclusion criteria that you might have in a clinical trial. Therefore, it can represent a more realistic view of the patients, the patient community, and broader population than the clinical trial data could on its own. And lastly, it helps us understand the true efficacy, safety, and tolerability of the patients in kind of their native environment in the real world. It can help bridge that gap that may exist from the clinical trial study data, which is a smaller patient population under controlled circumstances, with what's actually happening in the broader patient population that's being treated for certain conditions. So when do these studies happen? So the first time that these happen is in pre-launch phase. So during the development process to understand the kind of overall therapy area overview, the patient journey, the unmet needs of the therapeutic area, the disease burden, the treatment patterns that the patients are having, and the kind of unmet needs of this patient population. So it gives a really good understanding into what are patients currently experiencing, what are their challenges, and it can be used to help design more effective clinical trials that are better suited, that can fill more easily, and that can go to completion because they've been designed and filled in a way that is already bringing in kind of the awareness of the needs of those patients. Secondly, it can be used in the post-launch phase. So it can be used to help understand the kind of treatment patterns and outcomes that the patients are experiencing, both at a kind of a broad patient level, but also the different patient segments within the broader patient group. So you can look at the patient groups. You can look at it for potential line extension. You can look at it in terms of understanding and sharing more information about the efficacy, safety, and tolerability. And it can provide all of this information once the treatment is out there. So how does real-world data from social data fit in real-world evidence? So the first thing to note is social data, or as we refer to this in the title, big data, is online conversational data. So these are unsolicited conversations that patients are having, whether that's peer-to-peer, talking to other patients in a patient forum, or it's happening on a subreddit, or they're sharing their diagnosis on Twitter, or a public-facing Facebook group, or public-facing Instagram profile. These are unsolicited conversations, posts, comments that they are having, and that are collected through tools and aggregators that license the data and collect the data and help you work with this data. So it's a misnomer to just call it social data. So in this instance, or just big data, but I think a better term or way to think of it might be conversational patient data online. Both would fit under that banner. So how does this fit with traditional kind of data sources? So traditionally, you would be collecting information from that hospital visit. So what's being said there, what's being put in the notes, what's available in the patient registries, what's coming together from connected devices. This sits as another layer to add kind of the real experience that's not prompted by interviewers or questions about their hospital visits, about the medicines that they've been prescribed, about their interactions with their insurer. So it's providing this additional layer that shows the kind of patient perspective around efficacy, risk, issues with insurance coverage, unmet needs, and perceptions that may not be visible from these other sources that we've traditionally used for real-world evidence, because these other sources, the hospital visit, the patient registries, don't accurately reflect the patient's own language and kind of the complete view of the interaction, since it's not recorded by the patients themselves. However, this online conversational does share that language, share the experience, and their perceptions. Okay. So here's an example of what that looks like. So from the hospital or doctor's visits, we can see in these online conversations that patients are describing their interaction. What was it like? How long was the wait time? How much time did they have in that appointment? Information that comes from patient registries, where it's documenting the treatment of that patient. we're able to understand from these online conversations adherence issues, percentage of adherence, why people are discontinuing treatment, the challenges that they're facing that have led them to discontinue treatment. So for each of these examples of traditional real-world data, there is a counterpoint that's available through using kind of big data, social data, or this online conversational data to add context to these different real-world data sets. So the claims reports, in online conversation, we can understand the patient's kind of impact that the cost of the treatment, the insurance or insurance copay has on the kind of patient experience. So for each of these online conversations can be shedding light on the overall patient experience, whether that's shared by patients, caregivers, HCPs, or the patient advocacy groups. There are many stakeholders that provide valuable kind of online conversations and data that can be used to complement, augment, and give a more 360 view of the overall patient experience for real-world evidence research.
Yeah, so thanks, Jackie, for the introduction and giving the examples of where RWE or RWD data can be mined from social and utilized in certain situations. So just to carry on with that, I wanted to highlight a few more specific examples of areas where we have typically seen that RWE from social is pretty kind of important and insightful based on live examples and projects that we have done in the space. So particularly if you are seeing, there are three areas where I have seen that RWE data can enhance the quality and the inputs that we are getting. The RWD from social can enhance the quality and inputs that we are getting through other kind of forms of research as well. So one is patient pathway. So in patient pathways, where we basically get a lot of inputs from social, wherein we see that how patients are getting diagnosed with the condition and how are they managing the condition, what are the key touch points that they are getting, and that might differ a bit from the clinical pathway in multiple ways, right? So definitely there are certain clinical pathways that all diseases have and all pharma companies basically use, and we start with that. But when we see the conversations that are happening on social, we typically see either similarities or differences, or at least varying level of importance that patients give on certain attributes or certain kind of segments of the pathway. So example would be that typically we have seen that clinical pathways have a high emphasis on treatment sequencing, right? Like how the treatment pathway and what are the treatments they were first onboarded on, and then what was the next therapy. So that sequencing is pretty important. But we have seen that on social, based on patients' conversations, they are pretty interested in, we have seen that they are interested in treatment outcomes, right? And the overall disease management, because that is of prime importance for them, because end of the day, they want to be disease free, they want to be symptom free, they want to live a better quality of life. So that is what we have seen the difference from the focus from, rather than being it on treatment sequencing, it's more on treatment outcomes and overall disease management. And treatment sequence doesn't play a very important role until unless it is leading to a disease-free state or a better quality of life. So, and another classic example is quality of life impact. So again, from social is a very good tool to basically understand the quality of life impact that patients are suffering from or get due to the condition, right? So definitely there are other means of doing it, like surveys and forms and questionnaires to get an idea about it. But social can augment that data and give a more 360-degree view into it. So I want to explain this situation with an example. So for example, we have facet of questionnaires for quality of life impact. So for measuring quality of life impact. And within that, we can see that there are 4 categories in which the impact is judged, which is physical, functional, emotional, and social. And by default, the questions are framed assuming that there would be either a positive or a negative response towards each of this quality of life impacts. However, from social, we have seen that it has more levels of, or more level of detailing rather, and it's not exactly positive or negative. It can be even both, right? So there are certain factors that they think that they might have that certain factors of the disease is basically impacting them pretty negatively, where there are certain factors that is also helping them cope with those challenges, right? So it's a kind of mix of both, and it gives better layering of the impact, why it is happening, how it is happening, and what is the impact both in terms of functional as well as emotional point of view. So that gives more detailing over there. Another classic example is clinical endpoints. Now we know that definitely all pharma companies, all therapies are kind of aimed at achieving clinical endpoints, right? So it might be OS, PFS, ORR, response rates, etc. So, but when we see the data from social, we try to, though we start with the clinical endpoints that are there, that we typically consider as a success point for therapy, but we translate them into actual patient outcomes which really matter to them. So when we see that, for example, we can see that out of so we really see that treatment efficacy, survivability, lesser side effects, slower disease progression, better quality of life, convenience of dosage and administration. So those are the terms and those are the things that patients are looking for, right? So they do not use the terms OS, PFS, ORR. Those are the terms that basically is used in the clinical or the medical community. But patients are looking for a better quality of life, something that really helps them live with the condition and have a better outcome. So this is what we try to map the actual reported outcomes from patients with the parameters that is used in clinically. So as a process, this is a very top level view of how the process of extracting RWE from social data is, because it's quite an extensive process. But just to give you a broad idea, I will give more detailing on how we do it. But just to start with, we start with the therapy area or a brand, and we also consider the brands which are associated with the therapy. Then we extract all social media conversations, global, like universally, we call it the universe, and then we filter it to get to the priority stakeholder group. So in RW, we will always typically look into patient-centric conversations, which can be authored by the patient, caregivers, HCPs, PAGs. So, but it needs to be patient-centric because we are trying to capture what the patient's point of view over here. And once we have that data, then we do deep dive analysis around experiences, journey stages, treatment experiences, perceptions, switching behavior, unmet needs. So those are the kind of standard things that we analyze. But on top of that, to make it more insightful and RWE specific, we try to identify certain patient attributes like demographics, like age, gender, and then also we try to understand the disease characteristics, be it stage, be it time since diagnosis, or any mutations or comorbidities that they are suffering from existing. And then we try to map it with the efficacy risk profile of the drugs that they discuss, to kind of give it an entire flavor of real world experiences around the therapy, around the entire therapeutic area or any treatment options. Yeah, Jackie, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, great. So the data analysis framework, again, this is a broad level data analysis framework, how we generally work with the data. So as I mentioned, we start with the overall data, and at an overall level, we generally look into the volume trends, channels, and top posts, which is quite generally the starting point. But then we segregate the data and get to the crux of the data, which is the patient-centric data. And that is where we are looking at specificities like stakeholder types, like be it patient caregivers, HCPs, who are basically talking about the patient cases. Then the patient characteristics, that is their demographics, as I already described. Medical condition, so in the sense that comorbidities, any mutations, or even what is the disease stage that they are describing, or any other kind of description that they are providing around like time since diagnosis. Once we have the demographics, we deep dive into journey stages. So journey stage is something that is different from a disease to disease, but this is more like the broader journey stages that I've highlighted over here. So that starts with pre-diagnosis, then we have diagnosis, treatment, management, remission, recurrence, death. And within that, we have multiple levels of deep dive that we do. So typically we'll into diagnosis, we'll look into causes and symptoms. Or sorry, the pre-diagnosis stage will look into causes and symptoms. Within treatment, we'll look into treatment types, the features that they're discussing, efficacy, inefficacy, side effects, treatment discontinuation, any sequencing data that we can find, the top brands and therapy types that they're talking about, and sentiments associated with them. Quality of life impact is definitely a very important piece of our RWE study, because we are trying to assess what is the impact that patients have. And though we have broader criteria, as explained, like physical, emotional, social, and financial, we do update the categories. We can actually update the categories based on the disease type. And we do see like overlap between certain topics as well, based on a disease by disease basis. Unmet needs is something very important, because this is something that we don't really see on social, that patients will come up and say that this is my unmet need, or this is the information need that I have. So what we'll have to do is that during the analysis, we identify the unmet needs that they are specifying, or the basically we have to read between the lines and we'll have to understand what they're talking about. But typically we'll get unmet needs around information needs, support needs, unmet needs related to HCP interaction, around therapy. So we'll try to identify and categorize those unmet needs into those broader brackets. And end of the day, the entire exercise will basically try to answer business questions which are RWE specific from the data and the level that we can provide to provide quantitative and qualitative insights using this entire framework. Okay, so there is a, so as of now, I've been talking about like how RWE can basically support or augment or provide additional layering on top of regular other studies, but it can be also the other way around. So there are certain data sets or other data sets can rather help augment the social media insights that we are getting. And there are two areas where particularly in generally it's important to layer it with other data sources on top of the social insights that we are getting. So one is treatment pathway. So as I mentioned, treatment pathway is something that it's something that patients do not explicitly always mention until and unless it is something that is leading to a better quality of life or a disease outcome that it's favorable. So in that case, other data source can really complement this understanding that we are getting from social, in terms of like how is the treatment pathway and how is the treatment sequencing like typical for the journey. And on top of that, what we can do is that from social, we can provide the reasoning behind it. Like, for example, the reasons for discontinuation or the reasons for adoption or switching behavior. So this is something which is difficult to get from other sources. So we can kind of augment the data from social and the other sources and kind of provide a better journey as well as reasoning behind it. Same as the case with medical conditions. So patients rarely, they do not always describe their medical history or conditions like mutations, health behaviors, clinical history on social media posts. Some patients do that, but it's not a very general behavior. So in that case, patient survey data or other data from other databases is basically helpful for us to establish what are the prognostic factors, what is the typical medical background that patients are suffering from when they're kind of suffering from this condition. So that helps us basically define that landscape. And then on top of that, we use social media data to define better that, okay, if patients are suffering from these conditions, this is what they are talking about, this is what are the challenges, right? So it's a kind of combined view that we create, and that is typically helpful. Okay, so yeah, so again, this is a social listening RWE. From here, when we are doing the getting the data from big data, big social data, it's necessarily a social listening exercise only, but it is a bit different and a bit more complex because we are trying to get more attributes which are mappable and which we can basically track over time, or which we can use to provide inputs for drug development, for CTs, for other kind of surveys and questionnaires. So in a traditional social listening, the idea is generally to map the landscape. So be it like what is being discussed, who are the top stakeholders, what is the broad journey, what is the what is the sentiment on the disease or brands. In social, in RWE from social, we go levels deeper. So basically, we will look into the stakeholder type and behavior, but we'll also look at from a point of view of like what are the demographics, like age, gender, mutation type, disease type, smoking status. We are looking into patient journey stages, but we are going deeper down, and within each we are trying to look into, like for example, treatment. We'll look into the sequence, the clinical endpoints that people are talking about, and the drivers and barriers to discontinuation or switching behavior. So all those kind of leveling is something that will provide more details into how we map the patient category and the segment. And this is what we do in RWE. So we provide better detailing. So if you go to the next slide, Jackie, I'll just show. Okay, so this is, I know this might look a little complicated because it has a lot of tiers, but this is what I was talking about, right? So typically a social listening journey will start, a social listening study will stop at tier 1 or max will go to some bit of tier 2. But RW studies will start from tier 1, it will go to tier 2 and tier 3. So the difference is basically leveling. So while from a regular study, we'll see that, okay, what are the patient journey stages? Within RW study, we'll go to, okay, so within that, what are the subtypes? Like what are the causes? What are the symptoms? What are the diagnosis and tests? Even split diagnosis and test separately and see what are the different tests and what are the, if they're talking about certain indices, right? If they're talking about certain values from their test and blood reports, that is also something that will be captured and mapped against the patient group, right? So that we can say that, okay, so patients above the age of 40 years of age were actually mostly being diagnosed through this condition using this type of test, and these were the indices they were talking about. So that level of detailing we want to provide in our RWE study, right? And so that's why we go into tier 3 as well, wherein not only treatment, what are the top treatments, but within treatment we see sequence. If it is chemotherapy, then okay, then chemotherapy with sentiment, we want to see if what are the different combination therapies that they're using and when they're using it, or is it before chemo, is it after chemo? So those kind of things, what are the adjuvant therapies, or so all those kind of leveling we'll do in our RWE study typically. And a very important part is the cross tabulation part, wherein, so that's why we do a very pretty comprehensive exercise. We need to do a very comprehensive exercise in the backend, because in the cross tabulation, we are able to say by demographics, by patient groups, by journey stages, what are the different impacts and how it is and how the segments we can define better, right? So that is why the layering approach is very important in RW study, so that we can provide that level of granularity that will help us translate that big social media data into real usable real world evidence data, basically. So these are some, I'm just going to take you through very top level views of some of our study outcomes from RWE. So if you go to the next slide, Jackie, yeah. So this is a internal study that we did for MS. And if you see over here, as I was describing, we do capture like patient behavior in terms of time since diagnosis. So how many months, years has been there, like based on the historical data analysis of the patients from the post that we are getting, and also the type of disease stage type, uh, the quality of life impact, like physical, emotional, social, financial. And this is just the tier 2 level analysis. We go to tier 3 as well. So we don't have that much time to show that entire output, but yeah, this is the top level views. So if you go to the next slide, yeah, so this is the treatment switching behavior that we talked about. So it's like what, not only the type of like, not only it's switching between brands, but also switching between types of therapy, forms of therapy, like doses. So it can be between IVs versus orals, it can be between certain biologics versus other categories, or it can be between brands as well. And what are the drivers to the switching behavior? Yeah, and we look into the clinical endpoints. Again, so you won't find the standard clinical endpoints that are there in CTs over here, because here we are trying to map it based on what patients are talking themselves or describing themselves as the outcome that they're looking for. So be like reduced symptoms, no progression, pain relief, and yeah, no symptoms or in periodic remissions. And same with line of treatment. So again, it's not a very exhaustive data set that we get from line of treatment, but we do map the different lines of treatment and from what treatment patients are moving to which treatment form, and what are the drivers and barriers to it.
So we've shared what it is, how it's used, what it can look like once you've conducted this type of study. And now we're going into how we do this, and you can do this too. So we start with the data collection and cleaning. So the data is collected, as Abhinav shared, on the entire therapeutic area discussion or the brands and treatments available within that therapeutic area. So we use social listening tools that license the data from the different online data sources, websites, blogs, forums, social media, and we write a Boolean query. So this query can be inclusive as well as exclusive. So it's using terms that are relevant to the therapeutic area. So both the kind of scientific names as well as the language that patients use in their conversations to describe the condition and or the treatments. So this creates the overall greater data set from the kind of social media or big data that's available online. And then we start to drill down. So the next level is that we drill down looking for first-person conversations. So that filters out press releases, news, or conversations that aren't relevant to the patient experience. So when we say first person, we're looking at conversations or posts or comments that include things like my diagnosis, my child's diagnosis or treatment, or my medicine, or my last visit to the doctor. So it's this I, me, my, mine, we that we're looking for, and then the patient-centric conversations. So when they're discussing the patient experience that they may be having anywhere along the patient journey. And next, then we take a subset of that data, so a statistically relevant sample of the data, and we manually code that. So we code that, as Abhinav has already mentioned, looking at who is the stakeholder. Is this a patient, caregiver, HCP? What demographic information is available? Where are they in the patient journey? What treatments are they on? And using those 3 tiers of kind of analysis to do the quantitative and qualitative coding across different markets within that therapeutic area. So as I mentioned, the query development is a really important part of that. This is what is used to gather the relevant data set. So you're looking at the way it's spoken about from a scientific perspective. So a way a researcher, scientist, or HCP may be speaking about this online, and then also how the patients refer to it themselves, or sometimes even including potential misspellings, common misspellings. And this is used to gather that data set, and you can be exclusive as well. So show me all the results on this therapeutic area, but leave out any posts that mention feline or cat. So we do that a lot in leukemia and diabetes, making sure that we've done exclusions for veterinary medicine to help us identify the right data set. And that can take some time. So developing the query, testing it, seeing the data you get back, it's an iterative process, making sure that you have the best query so that you have the cleanest and most relevant data set to work with. And then how do we identify those conversations that are patient-centric? So we do that in a few different ways. So first of all, there are AI modules that use both kind of natural language processing and machine learning to help identify the relevant conversations and filter out noise. Then the next layer would be keyword filtering. So looking for the I, me, mine, your, our type of conversation And then manual review. So our analysts are reading through the data, cleaning the data in the dashboards, but also as they are coding the data, making sure that this truly is relevant for the data set. And if not, making sure that it's excluded from the overall analysis. And this analysis is done by humans, not using Google Translate, who understand the language and the cultural context, because as Abhinav already mentioned, patients don't log on to a patient forum and say, my unmet needs are. They use expressions like, I wish, wouldn't it be better if, how come, why don't they? And some of those conversations in the language they use can be platform specific. So different abbreviations and words used on Reddit versus Mumsnet. And it can be therapeutic area specific. So the way they refer to themselves or their doctors can be very specific to that. And then to the country or market that it's happening in, there may be cultural nuances. So for example, in English in the US, to kick the bucket would be a euphemism for dying. In Slovenia, it's he went to whisper to crabs, and in Germany, it's to give your spoon away. So there's multiple layers of understanding that you need to have to both from a language and cultural perspective to ensure that the right conversations are included or excluded from your data set. And then there is the manual coding process. So that is where you've extracted your statistically relevant subset of the data, and you, along with whomever else is engaged with the coding, have aligned on what a conversation or a kind of discussion should be coded as you're going through identifying the quality of life impact and what that looks like to the patient in those different markets. Discussion of genetic mutation types, for example, where they are in their patient journey, their treatments, so the treatments they're receiving, the treatments they mentioned they've had historically, why they may have changed or become non-adherent. As much information is recorded as possible from these posts and conversations. Again, it's important to note that these conversations, you're looking at a snapshot of these conversations, of the patient discussions, not longitudinally. You're looking at these conversations as a collection over kind of a period of time. So they've been gathered. Generally, we're looking at 1 year, but in rare diseases, we may be looking at 2 years or more. And then finally, bringing it all together, how do we generate the insights, right? Because at this point, you have a spreadsheet that's been filled in. So we take the overall kind of big data that we've worked with. We have kind of filtered that down for relevance and of the stakeholder group, of it being patient-centric conversations. We've taken out a subset. We've done the quantitative and qualitative coding, and then the analysts work to not just deliver findings from the research, but to take those and contextualize them to create actionable insights and recommendations that go back and answer the strategic business questions, but also help you better understand the so what, why, how should we be doing different business differently, and why does this matter?
Yeah. Okay, so now looking into the, I think already we have briefly touched upon most of these points, but I will just reiterate once the value of social RWE through the clinical pipeline. So looking into, so I think these are the broad areas where we see the most value that RWE from RWD, RWE from social can bring in, right? So first is understanding the patient journey. So I think that is something that we explained that in patient journey, we can really bring in a lot of depth and levels through social data, and we can really translate that into the actual journey with the condition that patients have. And it kind of translates, and it's very different from a clinical journey or a pathway. So this is where it helps us give a holistic understanding of how the journey is, and it can also act as inputs for further studies, and it can also act as inputs for the studies and kind of market research activities that are done to know how patients perceive the journey with the disease or the condition. understanding or identifying unmet needs at each stage of the patient journey. So in social media studies for RWE, we not only understand the unmet needs as they are, like as I mentioned. So first we split them into the different need classes, which is related to treatment, related to support requirements, HCP related, disease related, treatment related. On top of that, we map it on the patient journey stages. So we can do that. So that highlights that what are the key touch points that we are seeing across the patient journey, and where are the unmet needs that are there. So in diagnosis, is it the unmet need is around proper tests that give us proper diagnosis and not a avoids delayed diagnosis and further progression of the disease, or is it post diagnosis? Is it support requirements that is there? Is are patients expecting better information and care from HCPs, right, around the treatment course? So all those kind of unmet needs can be identified throughout the patient journey stages. Real world outcomes, so it will help us evaluate real world outcomes, right? Because as we all know that it is really important nowadays to and pharma is trying to get outcomes that are actually coming from actual application of the drugs and treatments, so which is difficult to get from our cities due to many reasons that are there. So this basically helps us enhance that outcomes that we are getting from real worlds, be it understanding of the treatment efficacy and safety outcomes, how patients are basically perceiving it. And it is a quicker and a easier way to get this information, which can be basically which can help us evaluate real world outcomes better. Enhanced value proposition, so this can also be done. So basically it will RWE data enhances the proposition of studies in terms of the efficacy of treatment and side effects, because we are able to get a lot of drug safety related information as well. So in that case, it kind of helps position in front of pharma stakeholders as well, like what is the value proposition of such data, because we get this data on a wider set as well. And in most cases, we have seen that getting RC data, kind of clinical trial data from patient cohorts which are difficult to access or vulnerable groups. But through social data, we can mitigate that challenge, and we can actually get data and inputs from these groups. And that kind of enhances the overall value proposition of the data, as well as RWE data, and it basically enhances the input that we are getting from that. It can also help in accelerated drug development and achieving market success. So the inputs that we get from RWE or RW data or social data is basically can help us understand how users are perceiving the drug, what is the sentiment towards it, what is the factors or features that they think are basically effective versus what is the perception about dosage, convenience, right? So all these factors can basically act as inputs for drug development. And we can also get inputs for better communication, patient communication, HCP communication, KOI engagement or influencer engagement, which can help in better market access. Pharmacovigilance again is an important area, because through social, through social, we get a lot of data around drug safety and like how people are kind of getting, what are the safety outcomes and what are the challenges that they're facing. And we know that typically it is difficult, like safety outcomes are either undetected or they are underreported. So social is a easy, cost effective as a long-term alternative to get safety data, which is because in certain cases patients, if it is a milder symptom, they will not report those cases as adverse events or safety outcomes. So this is something that is easy to track through social, and also due to anonymity of the fact that we are not basically identifying individuals, and in social you can maintain anonymous profiles. People are more open towards sharing their experiences with the drugs, and the quality of life impact that they actually have. So we are getting better safety profile information from social data. Jack, if you go to the next. Yeah, great. So the best practices for harnessing social media data from RW. So obviously we know now that RW is like social media is a great data source for RWE, and we have seen how we basically start with that data source and how we end up into actual actionable insights. But there are certain best practices that we need to keep in mind, or you need to keep in mind while we are kind of evaluating the data, is identifying the right data sources. Now we know that social media has a colossal volume of content. It can go up to millions for certain disease areas. So we can like, while we can focus on certain websites and certain channels which are more important from a pharma perspective, it is typically it is typically advisable that we need to consider the entire universe, so that we don't miss out on any particular conversation, or we don't miss out on any particular group of patients that might be discussing in that channel or forum. So it's typically, the wider it is, the more robust we consider the data. And also pharma needs to be equipped with the right skill sets and the data analysis tools to collect and filter the noise that is coming out of it, because most of the time we have seen that like studies get lost, or the outcomes get lost in the overall data set. But it's really important to get deeper, right, and try to filter out that relevant data set which actually matters. Translating RWD to RWE and clinical outcomes, right? So to effectively derive actionable insights from a large unstructured patient conversation data, which is social, I think it's very important to understand the entire social media landscape for pharma, to understand how patients really talk about it online, and how they can be actually translating those business questions that we have from RW perspective into questions that we can answer from the social data, right? So that is very important. And so there are obviously skilled team and tools is definitely a requirement. On top of that, there are some emerging strategies, including natural language processing, which can simplify the process. Definitely it will not do the entire coding exercise which Jackie just showed, but there are ways in which we can basically simplify the data collection and filtering process through use of AIs and search filters and terms filters, to basically get to that crux of the data, which will help us derive those data sets which is relevant. And very important thing is basically ensuring the quality and robustness of the data. To ensure the quality or robustness of the data, we always encourage, like we always work with pharma on a very close basis to understand what is the objective of the study, why they want to conduct the study. And also we do work with KOLs, which is HCPs and experts in the field, as well as patient advocacy groups, to understand what is the correct scenario, what are their pain points that they understand from their understanding of the patient community. And we try to basically incorporate that into our study and design, so that we are able to answer those questions correctly, right, outfully, and the outcomes are basically applicable, right? That is the main idea, right? So so basically that's the thing, right? So we try to demonstrate. So with this process, we are trying to create a structure, and we are trying to give a systematic process of kind of harnessing that big data into something which is more consumable in terms of insights and quantitatives, and which are relevant to RWE's perspective. So that is very important, so that it's like it needs to be a joint process between stakeholders to evaluate how, why, and ultimately what are the outcomes that we're looking out of the study, to make sure that the data is robust and the outputs are actionable.
So that takes us to the end of our presentation. We have a few minutes left for questioning, I believe, as well. Ben, I think there's a few questions in the Q&A.
Yes, there absolutely is. I guess just from my perspective, obviously, if anybody does have some questions, I can see some have already come through. Please do put those in. I did just want to kick off with quite a broad question, Jackie, now. I think it all sounds really great. I can really see kind of the value of it, adding some real kind of colour and depth to kind of decision making. I guess one of the elements that I was thinking as you was going through is kind of, how does this land with pharma companies? Not kind of insights wise, but kind of compliance wise. Are there any kind of concerns around kind of compliance and just the way that this type of analysis is performed?
Yep. So it aligns to traditional requirements around primary market research.
Yeah.
You have the kind of same guidance. Many of the pharmaceutical companies have developed specific guidance that kind of sits on top of that for social media or big data analysis. But the compliance is the same in the sense that you have to be aware of the AE and pharmacovigilance kind of reporting process. So if an AE is discovered, so you have to be certified. We have BHBIA certification, but on many projects, we also complete the pharma company's own pharmacovigilance certification and training. But speaking to the question that's been posed both by yourself and is in the questions that we've been asked. So how many adverse events do you typically generate? Well, we don't generate any, but we occasionally find some. Do you find it disproportionate amount because patients are more likely to complain or chat about AEs compared to other elements of their treatment or disease? One of the really interesting things is I'm pretty sure we identify AEs much less than other traditional primary techniques, such as an interview or a focus group, because when patients are speaking online about their treatment, they often say things like, I took my medicine, or I had my shot, and no brand, not even a generic name is mentioned in the majority of the time. I think the industry standard is like 0.2%. Reportable AEs, and we've seen similar numbers across our own audits of our research. They're fairly rare to identify all kind of criteria with AE criteria within an individual post.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you for that, Jackie. Few more questions in on the Q&A. So there's one here from Richard, which says, great presentation. My question to Jackie, from a data analysis point of view, is there a way to deduplicate / combine identical patients' input from different sources and channels?
So repeated content, so like a tweet or a retweet or a repost, can easily be identified and removed in the data set. However, across channels is more challenging. They may have a username on Reddit that's a pseudonym like Princess2275 that is not matching any Twitter profile because they're purple people eater. So identifying and linking individual patients or accounts across channels, it isn't really done unless they are the cases where we do see people that are identifiable and across channels is where they are key online influencers. So it may be a patient advocacy group, it may be an expert patient who speaks at conferences and has a specific username they use on every channel because they're driving awareness on a specific, their profile as well as a specific therapeutic area. So in general, we don't do that, but we can deduplicate where the content has been replicated. Abhinav, anything else you'd add to that?
No, I think that is correct, right? So for patients, we generally don't do until unless that they are really vocal and they are trying to kind of establish themselves as advocates in the field. For HCPs and other experts or influencers, we do that. So it's more like a mapping exercise that we do to identify the presence cross channels.
Okay. Richard has just shared a follow-up saying, how about detecting the IPs?
So we don't do that. We are not trying to identify individuals. We are trying to answer the business questions about the therapeutic area or all of the different potential patient pathways or outcomes. We are not looking to identify or target people.
Great. So moving on, there's another question here from Nicholas. How big is the data set that you start with from all the social media data?
So that really depends on the therapeutic area and the market. So for example, type 2 diabetes had over 8 million conversations in the US alone last year, whereas a rare disease in let's say EU5 might have a few hundred conversations. So it really depends on the therapeutic area and the location and kind of the is this a chronic disease, or is this, you know, an acute thing that gets treated? So all of that matters. The other thing as well is if you are looking at specific diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, where it's not necessarily the patient themselves discussing this patient information or patient-centric conversations, could be the caregivers or other stakeholders like an adult child who's a caretaker, or the spouse. So that also has an impact on the data.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up there from myself as well, Jackie, you know, obviously you say kind of type 2 diabetes have tons of impressions in the US, whereas a rare disease in the EU5 might be less. Does that impact kind of the robustness and the data quality that you're able to kind of pull through the analytics, or is it more the individual quality of the individual posts?
It's more on the individual quality of the posts that you're getting the information from. So, for example, a forum, a post which might be 3 or 4 paragraphs long, certainly has a lot more content and potential impact than a tweet that's limited to, you know, a sentence or two. The other thing to consider too is in that giant data set of 8 million in the US, when you're doing the analysis, you're looking at a statistically relevant sample set, but there's the law of diminishing returns. At a certain point, there aren't any more categories or topics or trends to be identified. There may be an individual outlier, but after a certain point, after, you know, 1,000, 3,000, it's not really changing the needle that much.
Yeah, so it maybe leans a little bit more, it maybe leads a little bit more towards quality over the quantity there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also to add to that, I think for rare diseases, since we're having that, we have raised that point. So I think the communities in rare diseases are very close knit and they're very involved, right? So it might not be a matter of volume, but in that case, the quality of discussions, the level at which they get involved, the type of discussions that they do, and the detailing that they provide is quite detailed, in depth as compared to diabetes, right? Because in diabetes, they will be just saying, well, it would be a very passing mention on Twitter, right? That, yeah, due to my diabetes, I had this challenge or something like that. But in rare diseases, the discussions are more in-depth and very driven, right? So the quality is different.
Yeah, great. And we've got one very final question to answer in the last 60 seconds, which is, to what extent is the social RWD/RWE approach tangibly different from traditional manual coding and quantitative analysis of social data?
So at a high level, traditional social listening projects are looking at the overall therapeutic area, so the broader patient population and major segments within that. Whereas the RWE studies are looking at those 3 tiers of analysis and specificity, and looking at every possible patient pathway, every possible clinical outcome. So just the layers of analysis and coding and coding on top of coding and segmentation and sub-segmentation that needs to be done for that is pretty intense.
Yeah, so just to give an idea about the difference in terms of the intensity of the coding process. So typically a social media study, and if you're doing a coding based approach, it would have some 40 to 50 parameters that we are evaluating or analyzing the data on. For RWE study, that is almost like 400 parameters. So that's almost 8x. Yeah,
gotcha. Great. Well, that's everything we have time for today. I think on behalf of the BHBIA, a huge thank you to Jackie and Abhinav for your time today. I think it was a great webinar, some really kind of good learnings there. And I hope that everybody who had joined it really enjoyed it. So thank you all for joining, and huge thank you to Jackie and Abhinav.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a lovely weekend.